I've noticed a gap in the thinking of libertarian views Scotty M, who is a great libertarian person. His videos are great and all. Um, and, as we know, for those of you who watch his channel, he often makes videos about the free market, how it works, and he has quite a big emphasis on prices. He talks about supply and demand a lot. He makes a lot of content about monopolies and subsidies, and a lot of things where he basically tries to say that the free market just, it doesn't produce monopolies and whatever. So many people on the free market, they point to supply and demand to explain value, and by value they mean exchange value. And yeah, supply and demand is true, I don't critique it. And of course, Scotty talks about prices a lot. I've never seen anyone talk about prices so much. But the problem is the supply and demand is that it assumes that all commodities are exactly the same, and it's quite limited in that sense. And supply and demand it's a classical position in economics, and it's not really the strongest position when trying to like argue for capitalism. So what kind of things would someone like Scotty talk about with supply and demand? With housing, he talks about supply and demand, but what he really does is talk a lot about demand, and he says that demand is constricted, and he doesn't talk much about he talks a lot about how supply is too little, but he doesn't talk about demand at all. All he says is demand is too high because of like immigration, but he doesn't talk about how the financial sector artificially increased demand. With wages, he obviously says that high wages are because of high demand and low supply, and vice versa when it comes to low wages. And obviously, with like a general commodity, like, you want to buy some shoes, and whatever. So, in one of the economic calculation debates I saw Scotty do, the idea of perfect competition was brought up, in which the socialist basically made an assumption that in order for capitalism to work, there must be perfect competition. But perfect competition is it's a neoclassical concept, and the neoclassicals, although they're free market, they're not very good at making good theories and arguments to support capitalism, because they their way of thinking has a lot of assumptions. And Scotty, of course, he says that there's no such thing as perfect, and that's great. But what he could do is actually use the subjective theory of value to actually expand his way of thinking. So the subjective theory of value is obviously identifying that use value lies within the thinking of the individual rather than the commodity itself. And of course, the subjective theory isn't what the Marxists say it is, where the producer just says that the price of the commodity is whatever the producer says it is, but it's actually that the consumer decides that the use value is obviously what really comes out of a product. It's whatever the consumer thinks in their subjective conscious. Ludwig von Mises says that economics is a psychology, and that makes sense because people buy commodities based on their use value, and use value comes in here. Quality is recognized in the subjective theory of value, and it's made obvious that all items are heterogeneous, because they have unique qualities. If you apply this to labour, it's easy to understand why there's people with high wages and low wages. Someone who's an Amazon worker gets paid little money because they are seen as homogeneous capital, and because they are homogeneous, the only thing the capitalist can do is hire the worker at a lower price. Because, if you line up all of the workers, they're not different to each other. And so all the capitalist can do is buy the worker at a lower price. And it's not like the Amazon workers are inherently better in quality. It's not like they differ in quality. Whereas someone like a software engineer or a doctor and architect, they have different levels of subjective quality. And so someone like a software engineer, like me, I'm a software engineer now, us lot have different amounts of use value that we bring to the company. And because of that, companies can be willing to pay more money because they're willing to pay more money for employees who bring different amounts of value to the company. And obviously it is down to speculation, because you can't measure use value, and use value is very tangible. So yeah, there's so much there is a lot of heterogeneity when it comes to software engineers. And that's why that's why workers get different amounts of wages. It's not just about supply and demand, but it's also about the fact that low-wage workers are so homogenous, whereas high-wage workers have so many different special things about them. So if you're listening to this, Scotty, this is for you. Listen up. And yeah, cheers. Bye-bye.